So now that we understood Databricks, the need for Databricks, let's take one step further and understand how does Databricks work. An important disclaimer here, guys. We are not going to get into details of how does Spark work. I'm just going to talk about how does Databricks work. Because how does Spark work is a discussion I'm going to reserve for another day, another session. But today, what we'll understand is how does Databricks work. It's a difference here. The difference is that Databricks makes use of Spark, along with which it also makes use of several other things. And that is what we'll see today, but not the internals of Spark. Okay. So what exactly is Databricks and how does it work? So what Databricks says is that I take open source apache-spark. I take open source apache-spark as one of the components to deal with data, and offer you solutions. But how exactly are we combining these two things into arriving at a solution? How exactly are we doing? So the idea is that there is one crucial component that's missing here. And as you said rightly, that's your computing architecture or computing framework. Spark is a programming paradigm, just like your Python, right? And there is data. Combining these two things, you still need to make use of something else in order to come to the solution. Let's take an example. You have customers.csv file available in your local hard disk, laptop hard disk. You have Python installed, Jupyter Notebook installed. You did pandas read underscore CSV, and then you created a data frame on which you are analyzing your data. But when you are doing all these things, how exactly is that you're getting to see the results? The idea here is that the data is stored in your hard disk. When you try and read the data and execute some aggregation operation, you are making use of your CPU, the processing cores that are available as a part of your laptop. And all the intermediate data as a part of this processing is being stored inside your memory. These are the three components that you are also using in addition to a programming paradigm and the data in order to come to solution. And that is exactly what being provided by Databricks. So what Databricks says is that I have a programming paradigm, a framework. And what do I do with this framework? I will provide you with solutions. I will provide you with implementations. And with this implementation, you can arrive at solutions. But in order to arrive at solution, what I also make use of is something called as a hard disk, a CPU, and memory. In simple terms, we call this as infrastructure. This is the missing component, a missing component that Databricks doesn't have. So what does Databricks do? Databricks says that I have apache-spark open source offering, along with which I have developed a lot of features, a lot of proprietary frameworks. You have the data with you. With these three things, you can come to the solution. But what is not there with me is infrastructure. I do not have the infrastructure with me. So what Databricks says is that because you are an organization who might have already stored data in most probably a cloud location already, you bring your own cloud subscription or cloud resources. I will offer you my platform, my proprietary platform. Together, we can combine and come to the solution and arrive at a solution. So this architecture, this infrastructure that you are seeing here is not provided by Databricks. This is part of your customer's own cloud subscription, or this is part of your own cloud accounts. All Databricks have with it is a proprietary technology, a proprietary solution, or a platform. When combined with the infrastructure that is coming from your cloud resources, together, when applied on top of the data, you're arriving at your solution. So Databricks doesn't have its own infrastructure. Databricks only has a platform, which, end of the day, is integrated with your own cloud solution or cloud account. And these cloud accounts, most of the times, would either be AWS or Azure or GCP. Because these are the most popular cloud solutions that we as organizations are using in current day, the modern day. So what Databricks says is that I have a modern platform with me. I have a modern proprietary technology with me. You bring your own infrastructure from the cloud account that you have with you. With the combination of these two, we can build a lot of solutions. That is what Databricks is. So Databricks doesn't own infrastructure. What it has with it is a platform. So why is it important for us to understand this? The reason is that the CPU, the RAM, the CPU, the memory, and the hard disk that we talked about a moment ago are coming from cloud account, but are managed using Databricks. They are actually coming from cloud account, but they are being managed by Databricks. So all the administration lies with it. That's exactly why in a cloud setup where you have your own cloud resources and Databricks, Databricks is what we call as a control plane. Databricks is what we call as a control plane. And because the underlying data and the underlying infrastructure is with your cloud provider, we are calling this cloud provider or your cloud account or subscription as a data plane. Okay. The reason why we need to understand this because you actually get to see the type of resources, you actually get to choose the type of resources you want to work with, but the resources are actually coming from the cloud. So you should also be aware of how am I going to get these resources from my cloud provider. And that's exactly the reason why you need to understand Databricks is what we call as control plane, and your cloud account is what we call as data. So Databricks is a platform that can be integrated with any of your major cloud providers. Any documentation that Databricks provides, it provides the same equivalent for both Azure, GCP, as well as for AWS. Okay, that's a good question, Neil. Let me talk about that. So Databricks has its own storage solution called DBFS, and it has its own solution called Hive Metastore. You actually see both of these things on Databricks environment or Databricks workspace. But in reality, the actual data is stored inside your cloud provider. It looks like it appears like the data is actually inside your Databricks, but Databricks do not have any of its infrastructure. Be it maybe the storage, be it maybe the actual compute servers that you use. All those are coming from either AWS, Azure, or GCP. So when you have Hive Metastore, what really is happening is that when you create a Databricks account in combination with Azure, what Databricks does is that it creates an object storage inside this Azure account. This Hive Metastore is actually stored inside this object storage, but you physically cannot access this object storage. It can be only accessed and controlled by using Databricks workspace. So the idea here is that although it appears like Databricks have its own storage solution, in reality, no, it doesn't. When you create an account using AWS or Azure or GCP, it chooses the solutions like data lake or object storage from those cloud providers, makes it as its own, then stores all this data that you are talking about inside that storage locations. If you want to physically access this, it will deny you because what it says is you are not the owner, Databricks is the owner. So if you want to access this data, you need to get into Databricks, then access this data. So the infrastructure is still with the cloud provider, but the entire control is in the hands of Databricks. So, yeah, please go ahead.
Soma, one quick thing.
Yes.
Maybe we can circle back in some other following calls.
Mm-hmm.
I believe all the compute that Databricks provides is actually on the cloud provider side.
Exactly.
And
right.
Generally, the ratio is 1:1 or 1:0.8, with the exception of serverless SQL warehouses. And
Correct.
If that's correct, let's confirm this in the following calls.
Definitely. So the reason why I was also talking about the control plane and data plane is that we just talked about storage, but at the same time, as Mohit rightly said, for you to use compute, you would actually need the servers. The servers or the virtual machines are also coming from your cloud provider, which is nothing but your Azure or AWS service. Okay, so the idea was that Databricks ensures the entire control is with it, but the underlying infrastructure or the underlying data is with your cloud, right? And that's exactly what is nothing but your Databricks architecture. You see, Databricks account is what you call as control plane, but the underlying virtual machines, let's look at Azure. But the underlying virtual machines, the question you asked, how Metastore, where is it really stored? It's stored inside ADLS or blob storage, which is nothing but the object storage of Azure or provided by Azure, right? So entire data is stored inside the customer's Azure subscription, also known as data plane. The entire Databricks account being managed, the UX that is being managed is what we call as control. Okay. Yes, with the exception of serverless technology, because they embed their own proprietary things under serverless. With that exception, rest everything is coming from, this entire infrastructure is coming from your cloud provider, which in our context would be Azure. As I said, we need to do some hands-on. So this hands-on will be providing you Azure environments where you'll be creating your own Databricks accounts and start working. Okay. You might ask me, why not AWS and GCP? There is no restriction. You could also go back and use AWS and GCP, but the setup would be a little complex when compared to Azure. Azure has got a pretty good integration with Databricks right from its inception. So we will be taking and making this Azure environment or Azure infrastructure to work with our Databricks accounts and do our things. Also, the reason why I came back here and changed the documentation from AWS to Azure. But you might be asking me, are there any changes from each cloud provider? Are there any differences from each cloud provider? The answer is no. The way Databricks works doesn't change at all depending on what cloud provider you have with you. The way Databricks works remains the same. Whatever it might be the underlying infrastructure, that might change because you are changing your cloud provider. Okay. So in your certification, they won't ask you any cloud-specific questions. All they will be asking you is Databricks specific questions. So one kind of question you can expect on what we have discussed up until now is, for example, I have taken a sample question. Just give me a moment. I want to talk about it. Yeah. You see this first question. Which location of Databricks product architecture hosts jobs and pipelines and queries? For example, you create an interactive notebook on Databricks. Where exactly is this located? The interactive notebook is with the control plane, the Databricks. But the server that is needed, the compute that is needed to execute the workloads of that notebook is with the Databricks. So the kind of question you might expect in this certification is, what would be the location of Databricks? What would be the location of these jobs or pipelines or queries inside your Databricks? Would it be from control plane or would it be from Databricks? You'll get an MCQ question. You need to pick between, or you need to choose between a data plane, a control plane, or whatever it is. So this is a kind of question you can expect in your certificate.
Okay.
So the things that you store in your Hive Metastore is not your actual data. The things that you store inside your Hive Metastore is not your actual data. The things that you're storing here is what we call as metadata. There is an aspect called managed tables and something called as external tables. We will talk about this next week, but the idea here is that, would you like Databricks to control the life cycle of your data? Or would you want to store this data somewhere else outside of your database? That is what we are seeing here. But nevertheless, if Databricks is managing or you are managing the life cycle of data on your own, point being that all these things are either way stored inside data plane, because this data is actually stored in a object storage or a data lake, which is part of your cloud provider. Okay. So to answer your question very quickly, there are differences between how a Databricks manages the lifecycle of the data versus how you manage the lifecycle of the data. There are minor differences, but point being that entire data is actually residing in object storage or data lake, which is part of your data plane or cloud provider.
Also, just to add one more thing.
Yeah.
The DBFS storage that you see in Databricks, is
DBFS.
that also, yeah.
Yes.
Is that also within the Azure or AWS bucket?
Workspace root storage for Databricks system or data. The architecture that you're seeing, right? This DBFS is also part of your control. Your data plane, the customer's Azure subscription. It appears like you can actually see that as a part of your control plane, but that's not reality. You can manage it using your Databricks, but the underlying architecture, so the underlying infrastructure is actually with your data plane or the cloud subscription. So that's exactly this.
Okay. The cost that incurs if we use, let's say, a DBFS to store data, does it get billed on Azure if it's on ADLS?
So the entire billing happens on Azure itself. A part of that bill, whatever Databricks charges, that will be sent to Databricks from Azure. But for DBFS, if you use DBFS to store the data, that will be built under Azure. Yes. But there are also some drawbacks actually, which we'll talk about in the next week's discussion.
Sure.
But the idea was that the billing will happen with your cloud. Yes.
Understood. Thanks so much.
Yes.
Very basic question. I'm
Sachin.
hearing data plane. I know Databricks has been changing terms recently.
Correct.
So are they calling compute plane?
Compute plane, correct. Yes. Very recent.
Okay.
This is a very, I think 1 month ago when I checked the documentation, they're still calling that as data plane. But just 1 month back, they changed the names and they're now calling that as compute plane. Correct.
Yeah. Okay. And that's also been reflected, do we know, in the certifications? Like we're gonna expect compute plane, not data plane?
To answer this question, I don't think so. The reason is that the certification was updated 1.5 months ago. And this change has happened after that change. So I don't think this will come in the certification. This also has something to do with, there's additional component on your Databricks repos actually. Even that is now modified, but that change is not updated in the certification. So in certification, I still think that it will be referred as control plane and data plane, but not as control plane and compute.
Okay.
But yes, to answer your question, they actually now renamed that as, they're no longer calling that as data plane, they're now calling that as compute.